If progressive overload isn't working for you, it's probably not because you're not training hard enough. It's because you're focusing on the wrong thing. Most people believe that building muscle is as simple as adding weight to the bar every week. And when that stops working, they assume something is wrong with them. A few years ago, I was doing the exact same thing, running a 5x5 program, trying to add weight every session, and thinking that as long as the numbers were going up, I was making progress. But eventually, I hit a wall and I couldn't understand why. It wasn't until I completely changed how I looked at progressive overload that things actually started improving again. And so in this video, I'm going to show you why progressive overload doesn't actually drive muscle growth, why chasing weight at all costs can hold you back, and what you should be focusing on instead. So let's break this down. So you've probably heard that progressive overload is the key to building muscle, which is usually defined as gradually increasing strength over time, whether it be adding weight to the bar, adding reps, improving your technique, slowing down the tempo, and achieving the same amount of reps. And while that's technically all correct, it's all true, there's a very important detail that most people never clarify, which is that progressive overload itself, meaning that form of progression, is not what causes the muscle growth. It's simply just evidence that muscle growth has already happened. And that little misunderstanding, that lack of a key distinction, is what leads a lot of lifters to believe that just the act of adding 5 pounds to the bar or a rep to your set is what builds muscle. So they just constantly chase weight and progressive overload on paper and then wonder why they aren't actually growing. And I know this feeling more than anybody because back when I was running programs like Ice Cream Fitness or Alpha Destiny Novice Program, which are basically just variations of 5x5 and 3x5 programs, where the entire focus is just on adding weight to the bar as consistently as possible. And to be completely fair, that mindset is very helpful for beginners. And if you have that mindset, you're already ahead of 95% of people because most beginner lifters never even make it to that stage. They're just doing a bunch of fluff and they're not getting anywhere. So if you're in that mindset, you're actually a step ahead already. But there's still some improvement that we can make on that philosophy. You often hear that you need to challenge the muscle beyond its current limits to force it to adapt. So logically, if you just add 5 pounds to the bar, you're now increasing that challenge. The muscle's lifting 5 pounds more than it did last week. And in theory, that makes sense that that would cause muscle growth. But that's not actually how it works in practice. And I'll explain why using this example. So let's say your current 10 rep max on a lift is 200 pounds. You hit 10 reps and you decide it's time to progress. So next session, you add 5 pounds and you go for 205. Now, we all know what happens when you do that. You're going to lose a couple of reps inevitably, right? Because you're increasing the weight and you're trying to get the same amount of reps. So maybe you get 7 or 8 instead of 10. And the reason you lose a couple of reps is because you didn't suddenly become stronger just because you added that 5 pounds. You could have added 10, 20, or even 30 pounds if you really wanted to, but that wouldn't increase the amount of muscle that you were going to build from that set. All it does is reduce the number of reps that you can perform. True progress would actually be being able to eventually hit 205 for then 10 reps, because that's when you've actually gotten stronger, lifting more weight for the same amount of reps. But in that scenario, the reason you would have gotten stronger wasn't because you added the weight. It's just because you consistently created a stimulus for muscle growth that forced your muscles to adapt. Because if I'm doing 205 for 10 or 200 for 10, my 1 rep max is probably somewhere around maybe like 250, let's just say, for example. I could do 200 for 10 reps and then next week say, oh, I'm going to add 50 pounds. Now I'm going to challenge my muscle even more. But then you're just doing a 1 rep max. And we all know that doing that 1 rep max isn't building more muscle than doing a set of 10. So by adding little increments of weight, you're always going to lose a couple reps at the beginning when you're using a double progression. You're going to eventually have to rebuild up to the same amount of reps. And it's at that point that you've built muscle, because over the course of that 5-6 weeks or however many weeks it takes to rebuild to the same amount of reps with that new weight, you're building muscle all throughout every session that you train. And it's that accumulation of new muscle that then allows you to lift that weight. So the real driver of muscle growth is the stimulus that you create in each session. Progressive overload at the end of it is just the result of that process. It's proof that your body adapted. Another example, instead of jumping from 200 to 205, once you've hit 10 reps of 200, you could realistically just stay at 200 and build up to 11 or 12 reps. And you would still build the same amount of muscle had you added the 5-10 pounds and just lost a couple reps. Eventually, both of those roads are going to lead to the same destination. So the focus shouldn't be on just forcing progression at all costs. I know we all love to add weight to the bar. I've been there before running these programs where you're super anxious before your first set of bench. And if you fail to progress, it's going to ruin the rest of your day because you're depressed. And you do everything you can to try and add the rep or add the 5 pounds. And then once you do, it's the most satisfying feeling because the whole session wasn't a waste and you're actually going to build muscle. But that's not how it actually works. Regardless of whether you add weight that session or the next session, both sessions were equally productive in building muscle as long as you train and executed the fundamentals, which is what your focus should be every time you go into the gym instead of focusing on the progression. It should just be to create as effective of a stimulus as you can every time you train, because that is the actual driver of muscle growth. And like I already said, if you're someone who is focused on progression, you're already ahead of 95% of beginners who don't even focus on that and just go to the gym, fluff and pump, play hopscotch on the machines. The problem is just that when you're solely chasing weight at all costs, a few things start to happen that can actually mess up your progress. And I use the bench as an example, so I'll use it again. The first thing is the range of motion gets shorter. So you start arching a little bit more, using a little bit more leg drive so that you can cut that range of motion. The reps get a little bit faster. You're not pausing as much at the bottom. You're kind of bouncing the bar off your chest. And the eccentric is getting a little bit faster each time. You're not using as controlled technique on the way down. You start using a little bit more momentum. And so all of these things allow you to progress faster, right? They allow you to add more weight to the bar and increase the amount of reps you're doing because you're cutting the range of motion and you're performing the reps faster. Now, at this time, I wasn't fully recording my lifts yet. I was a little bit, so I was able to kind of see the difference between a few months back and, a few months later. And what I noticed was that it was such a slow, gradual process that my technique just got worse and worse and worse, like shorter range of motion, faster eccentrics, worse pause. And while it happened slowly over time and I didn't notice it on a session per session basis, I kind of knew deep down, I was like, oh, that was a little bit fast, but it wasn't that much faster that it wasn't real progress. I still progressed, but I didn't because when I actually looked at the tapes, what I saw was that the technique had gotten so much worse that maybe if I had added 20 pounds in 3 months, maybe 5 of that was real. So that's why you don't want to be focusing on progression at all costs. You do need to exercise some level of patience because if you adopt this way of training where you're just worsening your technique or artificially decreasing the range of motion to try and get more weight, eventually you just hit a wall. You can only do that so much. You can only arch so much. You can only speed up the eccentric so much. You can only bounce the bar off your chest so much, where you'll get to a point where you just hit a wall and you can't progress anymore. And at that point, you'll have to reset your technique, in which you're going to then lose all of that progress you thought you were making. And it's honestly just going to feel so much worse than the feeling of just not progressing in an individual session. So instead of obsessing over adding weight every session, just focus on the quality of your sets. Focus on controlled reps, full range of motion, high effort. Maximize the stimulus because that's what actually builds muscle. And ironically, progressive overload will actually happen faster as a result of that. If you want to learn more about progressive overload and how to actually implement it, I recommend checking out this video here where I go further in depth into how I actually structure it in my programs. So be sure to check that out, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.